Episode 6. Before the transit point was a parking structure in Marquette, 4th level, northeast corner. A gray Chevy Malibu with Michigan plates and a key fob in the wheel well and a little over half a tank of gas. She found it at 6:14 a.m. The city was still dark. The lake was somewhere below the hill to the north, invisible, but the smell of it came up through the cold. Superior in November had a specific character. Mineral and flat and enormous. Nothing like ocean salt, nothing sweet. Just old water in serious motion. She went through the glove box. ICD transit vehicles were always clean, but she checked anyway. Registration in the name of a shell company she recognized. Proof of insurance. A gas card in the center console. Nothing personal, nothing left over. She put the key fob in her jacket pocket and walked back down the stairwell and out onto 3rd Street. The city was beginning its morning. A salt truck moved south on Front Street 2 blocks over. A light was on in the bakery across from the structure. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold in, and then went back up to the 4th level and got in the car. She drove east on US 41, which ran along the south shore of Lake Superior through the dead-flat industrial corridor east of the city before curving inland. M28 came in near Negaunee, and she picked it up and ran north and east toward the lake again. M28 was the highway of the Upper Peninsula, the way no single road could quite own a place. It followed the south shore of Superior through Munising and Grand Marais and Senni before turning inland through the swamp country, and then northeast again toward Newberry and the Salt. She'd driven it twice before in other contexts, and the road didn't change. 2 lanes, the forest close on both sides for most of it, the lake appearing and disappearing at intervals where the trees opened, the water gray-blue and vast when it showed itself. She drove through Munising at 7:40 a.m. The town was awake but quiet. A school bus was making its run on a side street, and she sat at the light and watched it stop and take on 2 kids in heavy coats and move on. The light changed and she drove through. East of Munising, the road ran close to the water for several miles. The surface of the lake was textured by wind, no sun to put any color in it. A line of white water where a shallow reef ran close to shore. The road here was close enough to the lake that she could hear it occasionally when the forest opened, the specific low sound of a large body of water working at the shoreline, not waves in the ocean sense, just weight. The lake was moving and the shore was receiving it, and the sound of that was continuous and old. Through O'Train and Shingleton and Chatham, the forest shifting from the mixed hardwood and evergreen of the lake corridor to denser spruce and fir as the road moved inland and the terrain flattened. This was the interior of the peninsula, the part that didn't have a lake view to give it identity. Just land. Wet in the low spots, boggy ground visible in the ditches, even now when everything was frozen, the standing water showing ice at the margins. Aspen groves where the trees had gone bare in October and stood now as pale columns. Old clearcuts grown back dense and low. Occasional small signs for snowmobile trails and hunting camps. The smell of the interior was different from the smell of the shore. Less mineral, more vegetative. The cold carrying the particular quality of forest rot arrested by frost. She stopped in Senni for gas and coffee at 8:22 a.m. The station was at the corner where M28 passed through, 2 pumps and a small store attached. She filled the Malibu and went inside. The woman behind the counter was in her mid-50s, heavy winter fleece over a thermal shirt, her hair cut short and practical. She had a radio on low country station. Renn got coffee from the machine against the wall. She put $3 on the counter. The woman took it. Made change. "Cold enough for you," she said, the particular social temperature of someone who says this to every customer in November and means nothing by it. "It's fine," Renn said. The woman nodded and looked back at her phone. Renn drank half the coffee in the parking lot before starting the car. It was mediocre and it was hot and she hadn't eaten since the previous evening, and the warmth of it was functional. She set the cup in the holder and drove. East of Senni, the road changed again. The wetlands of the Senni National Wildlife Refuge opening up on both sides. The largest wetland complex in the eastern United States, and from the road it looked like what it was. Vast flat ground with water standing in it, and dead grass rising above the water's surface and bare alders in clusters, and the sky enormous overhead without the forest to contain it. A red-tailed hawk sat on a power line pole and watched the car pass. No other movement visible for a long time. She drove through the refuge and the road returned to forest on the east side. A hunting camp sign appeared at a 2-track off the shoulder, hand-lettered, the letters pale. McMillan and Engadine and Naubinway, the last town before US 2 came in from the west along the top of Lake Michigan. The junction was marked by a gas station and a bar and nothing else, and she turned east onto US 2 without slowing. At the junction, she turned east and drove the final stretch. US 2, along the northern Lake Michigan shore, was a different road. More traffic, more towns strung along it. The lake showed to the south at intervals, Lake Michigan's color lighter than Superior's, a blue-gray with more green in it, the waves coming in from the southwest. She drove through Brevoort and Morin and St. Ignace, and from the rise before St. Ignace, the Mackinac Bridge was visible to the south, the long suspension span going over the straits where the two lakes met, the towers rising above the water. She didn't look at it long. She turned north onto I-75 and drove toward the Salt. The interstate ran north through forest for 40 miles. The road was dry and traffic was light. She set the cruise at 73 and held it. Kinross, Kinchilo, the airport exit. The terrain around the interstate was scrubland and second growth, the land flat and unremarkable on both sides, different from the wilder interior she'd driven through in the morning. Closer to the Salt, the road passed through cleared land where power lines cut broad swaths through the trees, and a few houses were visible on long gravel driveways set back from the highway. She took the second Salt exit, the one that came out on Ashmun Street in the center of the commercial district, and she followed Ashmun north toward the river. The city was a working city, not a scenic one. The commercial strip on Ashmun had the density of a town that needed what it had rather than a town that had chosen what it wanted. Hardware stores, an auto parts place, a veterinary clinic, a Chinese restaurant and a subway and a local diner. The International Bridge was visible ahead, its arch rising above the end of the commercial strip, the span going over to the Canadian side. She turned before it and found her way to Portage Avenue and the locks. The Sioux locks were west of the bridge. She slowed on Portage as she passed. A freighter was in the westernmost chamber, riding up as the water filled around it. The ship was enormous in the way that Great Lakes freighters were enormous, built to the exact specifications of the chamber, 1,000 feet long, low in the water, loaded. Crew members moved on the deck. The ship's name was in white letters on the hull, Edgar B. Spear. The water was rising in the chamber at a rate almost imperceptible but adding up fast. By the time it finished, the ship would have risen 21 feet, and the doors to Lake Superior would open, and it would move out onto the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. She drove on. Riverside Drive ran parallel to the river for several blocks. Cross's house was the fourth from the corner on the riverside. She parked on the street and backed in, the river in her windshield, the house to her right. She sat in the car for 2 minutes before getting out. The heat from the vents ran until it finished. Then she cut the engine and got out. The cold was immediate. The wind off the river came up between the houses and carried the specific cold of moving water, deeper than air cold, the kind that found skin through fabric. She buttoned the top button of her jacket and crossed the yard. The maple in the front yard had shed most of its leaves onto the grass. They lay flat and pale brown, too wet to blow. The porch had 2 chairs with cushions that had gone stiff. Nobody had been sitting in them recently. She knocked. He opened the door before she'd finished the second knock. Mid-70s, solid, the kind of build that had once been more solid and had softened slightly with age without going soft. Gray hair cut close. Blue flannel shirt, khaki trousers, house slippers. He looked at her, not at her face specifically, at the whole of her. Her coat, her posture, the particular way she was standing on his porch with her hands at her sides and her weight distributed evenly and nothing in her hands. He held the door for a moment. Then he stepped back from it. She came in. The front hall was short. A coat rack with 3 jackets, a rubber mat for boots with 2 pairs on it, both clean. A small table beside the door with keys and a pocket knife and mail and a library book with a red bookmark. The book's spine read Migratory Patterns of the Great Lakes in faded blue letters. He led her back through a short hall to the kitchen. The kitchen was the room where someone had actually lived. The counters wore their use in specific places. The wear at the edge near the sink where hands gripped it while looking out the window, at the cutting board area where the tile had been scrubbed clean so many times the grout had lightened. Behind the stove, the tile backsplash had absorbed years of cooking smoke and had the particular warmth of that. Cast iron in 3 sizes on the rack above the stove. The coffee maker sat at the right end of the counter, and the counter beneath it had a permanent dark discoloration where the pot had dripped and dried over many hundreds of mornings. A table in the center with 4 chairs. One had newspapers stacked on it. Another had a folded blanket over its back. 2 chairs were clearly in regular use. She sat in the one that faced the window. A window above the sink looked south and west, across the back porch and the strip of yard, and then over the road to the river. The water was visible from where she sat. The Canadian bank beyond the water, not far, the trees on it bare. He went to the counter without asking and began making coffee. He opened the cabinet above the machine and got down 2 mugs, setting hers on the counter first. The reservoir filled from the tap with the particular efficiency of someone who done this exact sequence every morning without variation. The carafe went back, the button pressed, and then he turned around and looked at her. Then he turned back to the counter and looked at the river through the window while the machine ran. She waited. The sound of the coffee running was the only sound in the kitchen for a while. The machine had a particular rhythm, the initial burst of water through the grounds and then the steadier pour and then the last slow drip. She'd heard 10,000 coffee makers and they were all variations on the same rhythm. This one had been making that rhythm in this kitchen for long enough that the counter beneath it had changed color. "November's the hardest month up here," he said finally, not turning around. "Not because of the cold. The cold gets worse in January and February. It's the light. The light in November is finished, but the snow hasn't come yet to give it back. Everything is just dark. The river is dark. The trees are dark. The sky is dark. You sit in the kitchen and drink your coffee in the morning and it doesn't get light until 8:30 and it's gone by 4:15 and in between it never really gets bright. It just gets less dark." He turned around and poured her cup first, then his, and brought them to the table and sat across from her. "I moved here because I liked the isolation," he said. "The cover story required a plausible retirement, and the program gave me a choice of 8 locations in the operational dead zones it maintains. Cities where the ICD has no active presence, and therefore no one looking at who comes and goes. Sault Ste. Marie was on the list and I chose it because I'd driven through it once on a personal trip in 1989, and I'd stood on the waterfront and watched a ship go through the locks and I thought I could live here. That's a reasonable place to be." He looked at his hands. I didn't know at the time that reasonable place to be and livable were different things. He picked up his coffee. "The first year I was here I didn't know what to do with myself," he said. "In the work every day has a purpose and the purpose is provided. You don't generate it yourself. It's given to you and you execute on it and the execution takes everything. Time moves the way time moves when you're always doing something that matters. The first year here I woke up every morning and the day was empty, completely open. Nowhere to be, nothing to do, no one waiting on anything I was capable of delivering." He drank his coffee. I filled it gradually. "I learned to cook, not well at first. I learned to cook the way you learn anything you're starting from nothing on, slowly and with a lot of failures, and now I cook well. I walk. I read. I watch the ships go through in summer. I know the season by when the freighters stop running and when they start again. The last one through in January, the first one through in March. I've been here 11 years and I know the rhythm of this place the way I used to know the rhythm of a city I was working in." He set down his mug. "I've also spent 11 years being someone I'm not," he said. "That part doesn't get easier. The cover story is that I was a federal auditor, mid-level, nothing interesting. I retired because I'd put in my years and I wanted to live somewhere quiet. It's a reasonable cover. I can sustain it in conversation. The neighbors think they know me. I'm the man with the blue house on the river who was a federal auditor and who walks every morning and makes good soup and watches the ships. That man is real in this neighborhood. He's been real here for 11 years. He was quiet for a moment. The thing about the cover story is that you don't know until you're living it how it separates who you are and who the cover story says you are. In the work, the cover story is a tool. It's deployed and withdrawn. You're always aware of its edges. But when it becomes your entire life and there's no other life on either side of it, the edges get harder to locate. After 11 years, I sometimes catch myself thinking of myself in the third person as the man with the blue house on the river, the federal auditor, like he's someone I know rather than someone I'm pretending to be. He looked at the window. My son David lives in Petoskey, he said. He and his wife Karen own a hardware store, Pine Street Hardware. It's been in Karen's family since her father built it in 1978. David runs the floor and Karen does the books. They have 2 kids, both out of the house now. He paused. I'm telling you this because you already know it and I want to establish that I know you know it. I want to have this conversation without pretending you're here for any other reason. All right, she said. The coffee maker had finished. He held his mug in both hands. David came up in October, he said. Not specifically to see me. He was driving through on his way to Houghton for a client thing and he stopped for dinner. We sat at this table. We had pasta from a box, the way we do when it's just us, and we had a beer and we talked about the kids and about whether David was going to put money into updating the store's HVAC and about a book he'd been reading. He stopped, and then near the end he put his beer down and said, Dad, I've been wanting to ask you something for a long time. He said it like that. He said, you never talk about your work. I know you worked for the government, I know it was something federal, but in my whole life you've never told me what you actually did. And I want to know. He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't pushing me. He was curious. He was 44 years old and his father had been something he couldn't name for his entire life and he wanted to know. That's a reasonable thing to want. I told him I'd done work for a federal program I couldn't describe in detail, he said. I told him that the work had required things of me that I'd been less than fully honest with myself about. Not in those words, but that's what I meant. I told him that some of what I'd done I'd understood the necessity of, and some of it I hadn't been sure about even at the time, and that I'd done it anyway because I believed in the larger purpose. He picked up his mug. That's true, I believed in it. I spent 30 years believing in it. By the end, I believed in it differently than I had at the beginning, but it was still belief. You don't stay in this work without something like belief. He set down his mug. He sat here for another hour, and then he drove to Houghton, and I called him on Saturday, and we talked about the HVAC situation, and it was normal. He doesn't know enough to be a target. I knew that when I answered anyway. He turned the mug on the table, one slow rotation. The part I've been thinking about is that I felt relief when I answered. Not immediately, about 30 seconds after. I'd been holding the shape of the lie for so long that I'd stopped noticing it was a shape. It was just the air I breathed. And then for 30 seconds I breathed different air. He looked at the window. I knew when I felt that relief that someone would come. I've been in this work, I know how it calculates. His son told him something. What did he tell him? What exactly did he tell him? What could he tell him? The calculation runs and the answer comes back and someone comes. 4 weeks from the call, she said. Standard review window. He nodded. You look like you've been doing this long enough to have lost count. Am I wrong? She said nothing. I was 41 the first time I was sent on an assignment like this one, he said. I thought I understood what I was doing. I had a framework. The program exists to protect human continuity. The people we close have put that continuity at risk. The action is unfortunate, but it's surgical and it's necessary, and the necessity justifies it. That framework worked for about 12 years. He turned his mug again, one slow rotation. By 53, I'd stopped believing in the word surgical. Surgery implies precision on behalf of something. By 53, I was less sure what the something was. She kept her hands flat on the table. You're wondering if I'm going to try to trade something, he said. Offer something useful in exchange for a different outcome. Are you? No. Flat, no hesitation. I'm going to tell you something because I want to say it before it disappears. You're the only person who's come to this table who would understand why it matters. He looked at the table for a moment. There's a particular kind of damage the work does, he said, that doesn't show up in any way you can point to from the outside. You're functional, you're effective. The work comes out clean. Your performance files look excellent because they are excellent. And inside that excellent performance, something is happening that doesn't have a flag on it anywhere. He picked up his coffee. I had a partner in my second decade, Rourke. We were paired for a series of assignments over about a 3-year period because our operational profiles were complementary. He was good at the aspects of the work I was less good at, and the reverse was also true. We didn't socialize. We didn't know each other's real names. We debriefed together after each assignment, and that was the extent of it. He set the coffee down. By the end of the 3 years, I could tell something had gone wrong with him. Not wrong in any way that affected his performance. His performance was fine. Wrong in the way I can only describe as a lights-off quality. Something behind his face that had been present in the early assignments wasn't present by the end of them. I didn't flag it. You didn't flag things like that. It wasn't in the operational language. And 3 months after our last joint assignment, I was told he'd been closed. Not by a third party. Internally, by the program. His own case had been reviewed, and the review had come back as a liability, and someone had been sent. He was quiet. I've never known which of us was sent. Maybe neither. Maybe someone I never met. But I've thought about it over the years, and what I keep coming back to is that I could see what was happening to him, and I filed it nowhere and said nothing, and 3 months later he was gone. I don't know if saying something would have changed it. I don't think it would have. But I said nothing, which means I'll never know. He looked at the window. The lights-off quality. I've seen it in a few people over the years, and I've never been able to stop seeing it once I see it. It's the thing that happens when the part of you that kept its own accounting runs out of column space. You keep functioning. You keep doing the work. The performance files stay excellent. But the accounting has closed, and you're operating on something else now. Something that doesn't have a name in the operational language either. She looked at her hands. She kept them flat on the table. In my 3rd decade, he said, I started keeping a private accounting, not written down, inside. Every assignment, I'd hold it afterward and try to locate where it sat on a scale between necessary and something else. Something I didn't have a clean word for. Excessive was too strong. Arbitrary was wrong because nothing in this work is arbitrary. I kept landing on the word administrative. A scale between necessary and administrative. He watched the table. The first time I noticed that I had 2 cases in a row on the administrative side, he said, I wrote it off. Coincidence. The second time I had 2 in a row, about 6 months later, I thought about it for a day, and then I wrote that off too. By the time I was keeping the full accounting, I'd stopped writing things off. I was just tracking. I was watching the ratio shift over years, and I was not saying anything about it to anyone because there was no one to say it to and no language to say it in. The operational vocabulary doesn't have a word for an assignment that is technically correct and functionally wrong. It doesn't have a word for a pattern that means something without being something you can report. The only person who would have heard it is someone doing the same work, he said, and you don't discuss it with them either. You might recognize it in each other, the way I recognize the lights-off quality in work, but you don't discuss it. The program is built against the possibility of 2 people who are doing this work comparing notes on what it's doing to them. The institutional architecture makes sure of that. He looked at her. Which is why I'm saying it to you now in this kitchen today, because now the architecture doesn't apply. Most of it was necessary. Most of it I could account for. By the early 2000s, the fraction I was filing under administrative had grown. I'd started to notice that those cases had a pattern. They weren't the ones who'd talked to a journalist or transmitted to a foreign service. They were the ones who'd started asking questions inside the program, internally, through proper channels. People who'd been in long enough to see the edges of things and had written a memo or requested a briefing they weren't supposed to request. She said nothing. Her hands stayed flat on the table. I had one in 2003 that I still think about, he said. A woman named Vasquez, senior analyst at one of the data centers. She'd been in for 16 years. She'd sent 3 memos to her direct supervisor over the course of a year asking about a discrepancy in the program's historical record around a specific date range from the late 1940. She wasn't asking about operations. She was asking about the record, about a gap in it. Her supervisor didn't respond to the memos. The 4th time she asked in person and her supervisor filed a report. I was sent within the month. He lifted his coffee. She lived alone in Bethesda. I came in while she was at work. She'd printed her memos out and kept copies in a folder in her desk, which told me she'd already decided she didn't fully trust the system she was working in. She had a daughter in college in North Carolina. She had plants on the windowsill that she'd clearly been tending carefully. I made her apartment look like what I needed it to look like, and I left. And 2 days later she was found, and it was filed as what I'd made it look like. And that was the end of it. He was quiet. The plants died 2 weeks later, he said. I know because someone in the building mentioned it to the investigator, and the investigator's notes were in a file I reviewed the following year for an unrelated reason. The plants died 2 weeks after she did because nobody watered them. He set the mug down. I don't have a framework for Vasquez that sits comfortably on the necessary side. The best I can do is, she was asking questions inside a structure that doesn't permit internal revision, and the structure responded the way such structures always respond to internal questioning. That's true, but it's not an accounting. It's just a description. She looked at him. Her hands were still. You're going to sit in your own kitchen in 30 years, he said. You're going to have your own Vasquez. I'm not telling you this to trouble you. I'm telling you because it's the thing I didn't know how to say to anyone for 20 years, and I'm saying it now to the only person who can hear it. She said nothing. How long have you been in? He said. Long enough. Your late 30s. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. You chose it, he said, not a question. I chose it. Every time. Every time I had a choice. He looked at his hands. I want to tell you about a body, he said. This is the thing I've been carrying longest. She was still. In 2009, I was given an assignment at a secondary research facility in Utah, north of Wendover, in the Salt Flats country, about 40 feet underground, accessed through a decommissioned Air Force facility. The surface installation was labeled as an environmental monitoring station. The facility underneath it was a research outpost within the recovered materials program. I was told the researcher on site had been making unauthorized external contacts, standard language, standard assignment. He drank his coffee and set it down. I arrived at 4 a.m. I went to the quarters and I knocked, and there was no answer. I had override access and I used it. The researcher was in the room, lying on his back on the bed with both hands at his sides and his eyes open. He wasn't breathing. He wasn't in any distress. He looked like someone who had been arranged. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the river moved. Not closed, not by another operative, not by any instrument, not by anything I could identify. He was simply stopped. The way a machine stops when you pull the power. He'd been in his bed and something had stopped him. She watched his face. The lines in it didn't move. I woke the facility's medical staff. The primary physician was a woman named Hoffer, late 40s, 6 years at the facility. She brought her diagnostic kit and she ran everything in it. The facility had equipment well beyond standard medical instrumentation, tools that had been developed from recovered materials research and weren't on any civilian market. She ran the complete diagnostic sequence twice: pulse, respiration, neurological activity, core temperature, blood pressure, organ function, cellular activity. She ran the cellular instruments 3 times because the first 2 readings were identical and she didn't believe them. He paused. Every biological system in his body had stopped at the same moment, not cascaded the way a body fails when one system overloads another, not in sequence. Every system simultaneously at the same instant, with no mechanism that any instrument in that facility could identify. No cardiac event, no embolic event, no toxin, no trauma, no pathological process of any kind. The cessation was complete and uniform and had no cause that the instruments could find. Her hands were flat on the table. Her breathing was even. Hoffer called it simultaneous termination in her notes. That was her clinical language for what she'd observed. She flagged the notation for review, and I told her the review would come through channels and that she shouldn't discuss what she'd seen, and she understood that language and she didn't discuss it. He was quiet for a moment. I filed the close as complete, cause of death as undetermined, which was technically accurate. The facility continued its operations. I was reassigned within 48 hours and I never had reason to return. What was he studying? She said. I wasn't told. His name was Marcus Webb. 44 years old, biophysicist, doctoral work at Stanford in the 80s, 8 years at that facility. His research classification was listed as pre-contact biological interaction, which I'd seen as a category in other facility files, but had never received a definition for. When was the facility established? It went operational in 1988. The materials it was studying came from a recovery in 1987. He said the year flat. I saw that in the full facility history as part of my operational briefing. He lifted his coffee and drank and set it down. I've been sitting in this house for 11 years turning that over, he said. The 1987 date appeared twice in things I was read into during my last years of service, in two separate contexts that didn't appear to be connected. One was the Utah facility's materials provenance. The other was a classification flag on a signal file I was shown briefly in 2007 and not given full access to. The flag indicated a detection event, 1987, origin classified at a level above my clearance. I didn't know what had been detected. I knew the year and the classification level, and I knew the facility in Utah was studying materials from the same year, and that's all I knew. He stopped. By the time I retired, I'd concluded it was probably coincidence because in this work you see patterns everywhere and most of them aren't patterns. But the body is harder to put down as coincidence. The body is a fact. Simultaneous termination is a fact. Hoffer's instruments were the best available anywhere and they found nothing. He turned his mug on the table. The arrangement of him is what I've come back to most. Both hands exactly at his sides, eyes open and level. No tension anywhere in the musculature, not in his face or his hands or his neck. Whatever had stopped him had not been experienced as something being done to him. The decision had been made somewhere and the body had complied. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. I've spent a long time trying to locate what that image reminds me of, he said. The closest I've come is the way a tool rests when it's been set down, not discarded, set down, with intention, by someone who knows they'll come back for it. The river outside was doing what it always did. A gust came off the water and pressed against the glass. You know what it connects to, he said. Not a question. She said nothing. I can tell by the way you're sitting, he said. You have something that goes with what I just said. I don't know what it is, but you've been carrying something in this conversation and what I just said got heavier for you. She looked at him. Keep going, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The last thing, he said. The question I've never been able to answer. I've been in this work long enough to know the difference between a program designed to protect something and a program designed to manage something. In the early years, it felt like the first. By the end, it felt more like the second. And the difference matters. If you're protecting something, it means you believe the thing has value on its own terms. If you're managing something, it means you believe the thing requires containment. You're not protecting it. You're controlling it. The control is the point. He looked up at her. I spent 30 years working for something I thought was the first thing, he said. By the end, I wasn't sure. And what I couldn't get past, sitting here, is that if it's the second thing, then the question of what exactly is being managed becomes the most important question there is. And I've been trying to answer it for 11 years and I can't. Not from inside a house on the river with a retired operative's incomplete memory and a 15-year-old scene in Utah. He stopped. That's what I've been carrying, he said. I wanted it to go somewhere before it goes nowhere. The kitchen was quiet. The coffee mugs were on the table between them. His hands were around his mug and hers were flat on the table. Your son called twice this week, she said. Both calls normal. He looked at her. He didn't look surprised by the transition. Yes, he said. He and Karen are going to her parents' place in Charlevoix for Thanksgiving. He looked at his hands. That's right. He doesn't know your name in any context that matters, she said. He knows his father. He was quiet. His hands were still. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. Has it been worth it to you? She looked at the window for a moment. I don't know, she said. I don't know if that's a question I've been allowing myself to ask. He nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. I know. The program works best on people who don't ask it, he said. It selects for them. It structures the work so the question feels like a luxury you can't afford. And by the time you can afford it, if you ever can, you've been not asking it for so long that you're not sure you know how. He was looking at her steadily. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, he said. No, she said. I'm saying it because I want to say it to someone who can hear it. He was quiet for a moment. I've been talking to the river for 11 years. She looked at her hands on the table. He stood. He moved around the table to the window and put one hand on the counter above the sink and looked out at the river. A long moment passed. The current was moving through the center channel. Far bank there, trees bare against the overcast. The sky above the Canadian shore was the same flat gray as the sky above Riverside Drive. His breathing was even and his shoulders were level and the hand on the counter was steady. "The Edgar B. Spear will be past the locks by now," he said. She came around the table. She put her hand on his shoulder. His breathing continued for 3 more seconds and then it stopped. She kept her hand where it was until she was certain and then she stood back. He was leaning forward slightly toward the glass. She moved him carefully with 2 hands. She brought him back to the table and set him in the chair that faced the window. His hands went flat on the table, palms down 6 inches apart. Both flat, palms down 6 inches apart. She checked his eyes, open, looking at the river. She stood across the kitchen and looked at him. His face was settled. The deep lines and the gray close-cut hair and the flannel shirt and the slippers and the kitchen around him that he'd used seriously for a long time. He'd been good at the work and he'd held the secret and he'd retired. And he'd lived inside the cover story for 11 years, and then his son had asked a direct question, and something in him had answered before the rest of him could decide not to. That sequence was complete. She went through the house in 8 minutes. The dresser in the bedroom, the closet shelf, a locked steel box there, standard security box. She took it. The phone on the bedside table she powered down and put in her pocket. The desk in the small office off the hall. A laptop, bills, a small framed photograph of David Cross and Karen Cross at what looked like a wedding, not their wedding, someone else's. She looked at the photograph for a moment and left it where it was. She went back to the kitchen doorway. He was in the chair. The river was in the window behind him, both hands flat on the table. She left through the back door and walked around the side of the house to the street. A woman was walking a terrier 40 yards east, not looking in her direction. Renn walked to her car and got in. She sat for a moment before starting it. The river was across the road, dark water, moving fast near the center where the current ran deepest. The surface there had a slight chop, disturbed by the speed of the current underneath. On the Canadian side, the trees stood bare against the overcast sky. She started the engine and drove. She drove west on Portage past the locks, the Edgar B. Spear gone from the chamber empty now, filling back to receive the next ship. She picked up I-75 south and drove through the scrubland south of the city, the river valley falling away behind her. She found M28 at the junction and turned west. The drive back was the same drive in the other direction, same bare trees. The light had not improved and it was beginning to go by 2:30 p.m., the sky darkening from the east as she drove into it. She stopped in Newberry for gas at 3:48 p.m. She made the call from the parking lot, engine running. "Sault Ste. Marie," she said. "Complete." The voice asked. "Complete. Transport at the Marquette structure 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. Transit point stands until 8:15. "Understood." She ended the call and sat for a moment. The parking lot was empty except for a pickup at the other pump. A man in a Carhartt jacket was filling it and looking at his phone. He didn't look at her car. She pulled back out onto M28 and drove. West of Newberry, the road returned to the long, straight corridor through the spruce and fir country, the trees close and dark on both sides, the sky above them lightening slightly where it was still clear to the west before it went dark there too. She drove with the headlights on. The road was visible for half a mile ahead in the flat country, empty, the center lines coming up in the headlights and going under the car one after another. She drove through the Seni refuge in the dark, the open sky above the wetlands and the complete absence of trees telling her she was in the open. A deer stood at the edge of the road's shoulder, and she saw its eyes in the headlights before she saw its body, and she braked slightly, and it stood and watched the car pass without moving. Then the forest closed in again, and the deer was gone. She thought about simultaneous termination, about what it meant for every system to stop at once with no mechanism, and no cascade, and no cause that any instrument could find. She thought about the phrase pre-contact biological interaction, which she had read before, not in a Utah facility file. In a different file, a file she'd been shown as background in a briefing 3 years ago, the briefing that had given her a partial picture of FSA Sublevel 2 and what had been logged in the gradient sensor since 1987. The phrase had appeared in the classification header of a study she'd been shown 2 pages of before the document had been taken back. She'd read fast. Pre-contact biological interaction. 1987. The facility in Utah studying recovered materials from a 1987 recovery. FSA's gradient sensor installed in 1987, logging its first reading that same year. Stable anomaly, continuous. Cross had said, toward the question of what exactly we're continuous with. He hadn't known he was connecting anything. He'd had one end of a thread he'd been holding for 15 years, and she was holding the other end, and neither of them had known. Now she knew. And he was in a chair in a house on the river with his hands flat on the table looking at the water. West of Senni, she picked up US 2 at the bottom of the peninsula and drove through Manistee and Rapid River in the dark. The towns were lit up against the dark, their gas stations and stores visible from the road, and then the dark closed in again after each one and the forest took over. She drove the same way she did everything, without waste, cruise at a consistent speed, hands at 10 and 2, eyes working the full sweep of the headlights. Driving long distance in the dark was a particular kind of nothing, the road giving you just enough to keep you present without requiring anything. You didn't have to think. You could think anyway. You could hold something up and look at it from several angles without the road demanding anything back. She'd done some of her best thinking on roads like this. She'd done some of her worst on them too. Somewhere east of Rapid River, on a straight empty stretch of US 2 with nothing on either side but trees and the flat sky, she thought about the coffee. Not what he'd said. Not the body in Utah or the phrase or the 15 years. Not Rourke with the lights-off quality. Not Vasquez in Bethesda with the plants on the windowsill that died 2 weeks later because nobody watered them. She thought about the coffee itself, the sequence of it. He'd gotten the 2 mugs down from the cabinet, and he'd set hers on the counter first, before his own, the reflex of hospitality that had no calculation in it, that he'd done without thinking because it was what you did when someone came into your kitchen. He'd filled the reservoir from the tap with the single-handed pour of long practice. He pressed the button and stood at the counter and watched it run, because he always stood at the counter and watched it run in the morning, because that was how you started the morning, standing at the counter watching the coffee run. And he'd done it 11,000 mornings, and he did it the same way the last time he did it as he'd done it the first. He'd brought her cup to her first. She didn't think about it for long. Filed it the way she filed things she wasn't going to act on immediately. Put it somewhere she'd know to look. The road ran ahead of her, and the forest was close on both sides, and the headlights picked up 50 yards at a time, and she drove. She drove through Rapid River and Iron Mountain and the long, dark approach to Marquette. She found the parking structure on 3rd Street and drove to the 4th level and parked 3 spaces from the gray Malibu. The steel box and the phone transferred from the rental to the Malibu. Both cars locked. She stood for a moment on the open 4th level. The lake was somewhere beyond the hill to the north. She could smell it through the structure, the cold and the mineral and the flat particular weight of Superior in November. Her jacket was buttoned to the collar. The photograph was in the inside pocket. The data chip was in her left front pocket. The steel box was in the Malibu with everything Cross had held for 15 years. She walked toward the stairwell. The Holiday Inn on Front Street had her room under a name that wasn't hers. She walked the 4 blocks. The wind was off the lake tonight, harder than it had been in the morning. In the room, she sat on the edge of the bed and did not turn on the lights. The heat cycled through the baseboard vents with the particular sound of hotel heating, a dry, low hiss, curtains drawn. A line of parking lot light came through the gap and crossed the carpet. She sat in the dark for a long time. Cross had said, if the program is actually managing something rather than protecting it, then the question of what exactly is being managed becomes the most important question there is. She had 12 people to report to. She had a photograph and a data chip she had not reported. She had a gradient file she had not reported. She had now a dead biophysicist from 2009 and a phrase in a classification header and a 1987 date that pointed 3 directions at once. Her hands went to her thighs. She lay back on the bed with her jacket on and stared at the ceiling. The photograph was in her inside pocket. The data chip was in her left front pocket. She hadn't taken it out since the asteroid belt. She knew what it said. She'd memorized it. One line of text in Malone's handwriting. 8 words that pointed at something without a frame yet. Cross hadn't known about the chip. He hadn't known about Ewan's gradient file, or the photograph from Detroit, or the man in Chicago who'd watched her for 4 days with methods that didn't match any human intelligence service she knew. He'd had none of those things, and he'd arrived at the same question she'd been circling. What exactly is being managed, and by whom, and since when? She kept her hands flat on her thighs. Not in a hotel room in Marquette. Not alone, not yet. She thought about what Cross had said about work. The lights-off quality. Something behind the face that had been present and then wasn't. She'd been looking for it in herself for years, in the same way you checked a tire, briefly, periodically, in passing, not wanting to find anything. She didn't know what she'd do if she found it. She hadn't made a plan. The plan was to not find it. Cross had found it in work and said nothing. 3 months later, someone came. She'd been told about cases like that in her early years, obliquely, without being told that's what she was being told about. You develop judgment about your colleagues. You make reports when your reports are warranted. You don't make reports about things that are operational states rather than operational problems. The distinction between an operational state and an operational problem was something you were expected to understand without being given a definition. Cross had understood the distinction. He'd looked at work and classified what he was looking at as an operational state and kept it there. 3 months later, he'd found out he'd been wrong about the classification, or right about it and wrong about what the program did with operational states. Both present, both not taken out. She was awake at 3:50 a.m. She got up and went to the desk and sat in the desk chair and put her hands flat on the surface. Until 5:30 a.m. The data chip stayed in her pocket. The photograph stayed in her pocket. Both of them present. 11,000 mornings of making coffee alone. Then one morning you make it for 2 and you bring the guest's cup first and you answer a question, and something that's been sealed for 30 years opens for 30 seconds. That was what you got. 30 seconds of different air. Then someone comes and finds your chair and your window and your river and you're in it. At 5:30 she stood and went to the window. The parking lot was lit. 3 cars. The street beyond empty. The sky beginning to differentiate from the tree line to the east. She went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her hands and face and stood at the mirror. Her face was the same face. The specific neutral surface of it that she'd been presenting to rooms like Cross's kitchen for years. She turned off the light. At 6:00 a.m. She checked out and walked to the parking structure in the cold. The transport vehicle came at 7:58 a.m. A black Suburban with plates she recognized by category without reading the number. She transferred the box to the back seat. She got in. The driver was ICD. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. He pulled out onto 3rd Street and headed south. She watched Marquette through the window. The hill with the hospital at the top. The residential blocks. The waterfront and the ore dock, enormous. The loading machinery rising above the lake. The lake itself showing briefly at the end of a cross street, gray and wide and in motion. The forest began and the city was behind her. She kept her hands in her lap and watched the road. Somewhere north of this, on Superior, a ship she hadn't seen was running. Somewhere east of this, in a house on the river, a man was in a chair with his hands on a table and his eyes open looking at the water. Looking at a view he'd looked at 11,000 mornings. The same water doing the same thing, the Canadian shore not far. The road ran south through the bare forest and she drove.